All right, get ready, because we're diving into a huge, a massive chunk of English history here, spanning from 410 to 1400 AD.
Wow.
I know, right?
So
That's like going from when Rome fell apart all the way to like almost the Renaissance.
yeah.
And you've given us a ton of sources to work
A
with.
mountain of sourcing.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is try to focus on, the most interesting and like insightful parts for everyone listening.
It's a period that still resonates, in English culture today. Language, even.
Oh, for sure. And we're talking about some pretty intense stuff like fierce warriors, power struggles. I mean, Game of Thrones has nothing on this.
Yeah.
And inventions that like totally changed daily life. Oh, and maybe even a little bit of courtly love sprinkled in there too.
Just a tad.
Exactly. This isn't just about dates and names in a textbook. This is about how people actually live their lives.
Absolutely. And it all begins with, quite a dramatic exit. The Romans leaving Britain in 410 AD. That left a huge power vacuum.
Right. And then in come the Anglo-Saxons.
Yep.
Okay, so who were these Anglo-Saxons? I know they came from somewhere up north, in Europe, but were they like a united group or more like a bunch of different, I don't know, factions or something?
Yeah, more like a collection of different tribes, really. They came from places we now know as Germany and Denmark. And they had this warrior culture, Strength and combat were, like, really important to them.
Right. Makes sense. And they didn't create a single English nation, did they?
No, no, they formed many different kingdoms all across the land, each with their own goals, and often rivalries with each other.
Gotcha. So not a united England just yet. And speaking of those kingdoms, the sources actually had this really cool table listing them all out. I was especially interested in Kent, how they were the first to adopt Christianity.
Oh, right. Yes.
And then there's Mercia with Offa's Dyke, which
Hmm.
is like this massive earthwork built to keep the Welsh out. Makes you think what kind of rulers would take on a project that big. And of course, we can't forget about the Sutton Hoo ship burial in East Anglia.
Oh, yes, the treasure.
Right. That whole treasure trove is like a window into uh, their beliefs about what happens after you die. It's pretty amazing to think that all these different kingdoms were thriving all across England.
Each one had its own distinct character, you could say. And they all left their mark on history. And while we tend to, focus a lot on the Vikings later on, life before they arrived was more complex than many realize.
Yeah, it's easy to just think about like Vikings raiding and pillaging, but what was daily life actually like back then, before all that? I mean, from what I saw in the sources, they were surprisingly advanced.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't all about farming.
Although that was important, right?
Well, yes, of course. But they also had, skilled craftspeople, trade networks stretching across Europe. These were interconnected communities.
So not just isolated groups.
Exactly. And, to kind of understand it, their society was divided into three main tiers: the working man, the churchman, and the warrior.
Ah, okay, like a hierarchy, sort of.
Yes, exactly. But even within those tiers, there were different layers. Like amongst the working men, you had free men who had rights and could own property. But then you also had serfs who were tied to the land, and even slaves.
Wow, so there was like social mobility,
Yeah.
or maybe the lack of it, even way back then. The sources really painted a picture of these different levels of society, like thatched roofs, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer, traders bringing back all these exotic goods from far away. Can you imagine? The sights, the sounds. It must have been such a lively place.
Yeah. There would have been a strong sense of community,
Right.
even with all the hardships.
And that sense of community would have really been tested as Christianity started to spread, right?
That's right.
I mean, think about it. They went from worshiping gods like Woden and Thenor, which, by the way, we still hear in Wednesday and Thursday,
Oh, that's right, yeah.
to adopting a whole new religion. That's not just about changing who you pray to, is it?
Oh, no, not at all. This shift from their old gods to Christianity, it had huge implications. The power structures changed as the church gained influence. Literacy spread because of the monasteries and people's whole worldview, how they saw the universe and themselves in it. That was completely altered.
It's like hitting the reset button on their entire culture.
In a way, yes.
And that set the stage for how powerful the church would become for centuries to come.
Exactly.
But before we get into that, there's another massive event we need to discuss. Cue the dramatic music.
Yeah.
1066, the Norman Conquest.
Oh, yes. Quite a turning point.
William the Conqueror, he comes over from Normandy, defeats the English at, was it the Battle of Hastings?
That's the one.
And suddenly, everything changes. New king, new language, and a new system. Feudalism.
Big changes indeed.
So I've heard of feudalism, but honestly never really understood it. Was it like a pyramid scheme with swords and horses?
Well, maybe not a pyramid scheme, but I see what you mean. It was very hierarchical, yes. Imagine a pyramid, right? The king is at the very top, and he owns all the land,
Okay.
and he gives portions of this land to his loyal barons, sort of like slices of cake.
I like it.
And in exchange, the barons pledge their military service to him.
Makes sense.
And those barons then do the same thing with knights below them, and so on, all the way down to the peasants who actually work the land.
So everyone owes something to the person above them. Okay, got it. And the Normans brought this whole system to England in 1066. Was it totally new, or did the Anglo-Saxons have something similar already?
Well, the Anglo-Saxons had their own ideas about land ownership and oaths of loyalty, but the Normans, they made it much more rigid, more formal.
So it was a way to, like, really solidify their power.
Yes, precisely. And to help with that, they even created the Doomsday Book.
The Doomsday Book, what was that?
It was this incredible record of every single piece of property in England. Who owned it, what it was worth, how many people lived there, everything.
Wow, that's a lot of paperwork.
It wasn't just about counting sheep, though. It was a way to assert their control.
Right, to establish themselves as the ones in charge.
Exactly.
Talk about a power move. And speaking of Norman influence, their language had a huge impact on English, didn't it? Like, so many of the words we use today come from French because of them.
Oh, absolutely. Words like beef, pork, government, they all entered English during this period.
No, I never really thought about that. It's crazy how events from centuries ago shaped the very language we're speaking right now.
It is fascinating, isn't it? And it wasn't just vocabulary either. Norman French influenced English, grammar, syntax, the whole structure.
So they didn't just add new words, they like changed the recipe of English.
Exactly.
So we've got new rulers, a new system, a new language swirling around. What else did the Normans bring to the table?
Well, they were big on architecture, castles especially, castles everywhere, as a way to, project their power across the landscape.
I can just picture it. These massive stone fortresses popping up all over England, just as a reminder.
Constant reminder, yes.
And it wasn't just castles, was it? They also brought a new style of church, Romanesque. The ones that look almost like fortresses themselves, compared to, those delicate Gothic cathedrals that came later.
You're exactly right. Romanesque churches with their thick walls, rounded arches, they were a powerful symbol of Norman authority.
Yeah, definitely. And this era also saw a new concept emerge. Chivalry. Knights in shining armor. Courtly love. The whole, romanticized warrior code. Makes you wonder how much of that was actually real and how much was, propaganda.
It was certainly more of an ideal than consistent practice, let's say. But it had a huge influence on culture and literature for centuries to come.
It's like the medieval version of a superhero comic. But even with stories of brave knights and grand castles, it wasn't all sunshine and roses, right?
Right.
We're talking about the medieval period now, 1154 to 1400. And there was a lot of turmoil alongside all the progress, wasn't there?
Oh, yes. We've got the Plantagenet kings constantly fighting wars, both within England and abroad. And then there's Parliament starting to take shape, and of course, the Black Death.
Right, the Black Death. It's hard to even comprehend a pandemic that wipes out that much of the population. How did it change things? I mean, beyond just the immediate devastation, were there lasting effects?
Oh, the Black Death had a profound impact. Social, economic, even religious. It led to labor shortages, which actually gave peasants more leverage.
Oh, interesting.
They could demand better wages, better working conditions.
And this is what led to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, right?
Yes, exactly. It wasn't just about the plague. It was about a growing discontent amongst the lower classes.
So what were they demanding? How did that revolt affect the power balance?
Well, the Peasants' Revolt, it was the culmination of various factors. You had high taxes levied to pay for all these wars, and then there was the growing gap between the rich and the poor. And, of course, all these policies that limited the peasants' freedoms.
They had it every...
Exactly. And the Black Death, by, creating this labor shortage, it actually empowered the peasants to stand up for themselves.
So even in these dark times, there was this push for change. It's fascinating. And what's even more interesting is that alongside all this unrest, there were these incredible technological advancements, like mechanical clocks, for instance. Can you imagine a world without clocks?
It's mind-boggling, isn't it?
What other innovations were, shaping daily life back then?
Well, eyeglasses were another game changer. Before the 13th century, if you had bad eyesight, you were pretty much out of luck.
Yeah.
But with eyeglasses, people could finally see clearly.
And that must have had a huge effect on, like, literacy and learning, right?
No, absolutely. And the spinning wheel, that revolutionized how textiles were produced. Suddenly, cloth was more readily available.
It's amazing how something that seems so simple now had such a ripple effect back then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And while all this is happening, the English language itself is undergoing a massive transformation. We started with Old English, then had the Norman French influence, and what did that lead to? Well, towards the end of this period, we see the emergence of Middle English, which is this blend of Old English and Norman French.
A hybrid language.
Exactly. It's actually closer to the English we speak today, though still quite different. It really highlights how language is always evolving.
It's like a linguistic time capsule. So, to recap, we've covered a ton. Scattered kingdoms becoming a more unified nation, massive shifts in power, religion, technology, even how people thought about the world. It's mind-boggling, to be honest.
Yeah.
What does it all mean?
Well, by 1400, England was on the verge of something new, the Renaissance. But all the groundwork for that transformation, it was laid during these tumultuous centuries.
So we're seeing the very beginnings of what we think of as English today.
Exactly. The language, the legal systems, even ideas of individual liberty all have their roots in this era.
It's like holding a piece of ancient pottery and knowing that hands from centuries ago shaped it.
Precisely. And that connection to the past is something to keep in mind as we continue exploring these sources.
Absolutely. We've only just scratched the surface of this incredible period in history, and there's so much more to discover.
There is indeed. Shall we dive a bit deeper into some of the fascinating details? It really makes you think about that long journey, all the things that led to the England we know today.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history isn't just about kings and battles and stuff. It's about, like, regular people and the things that shape their lives. Speaking of which, we talked a bit about Anglo-Saxon government earlier. They had these councils called Wittens, right?
Yes, the Witan.
So what did they actually do? Like, what was their role in making decisions?
Well, the Witan was basically a council of advisors to the king. It was made up of nobles, bishops, and other important figures.
Okay.
And they would offer advice on all sorts of things. Laws, taxes, even war and peace.
So not a democracy like we have today, but it sounds like the Anglo-Saxon kings weren't exactly dictators either.
That's right. They had to at least consider the opinions of the Witan. It wasn't a system of one-man rule.
Were there any, like, limits to the king's power? Could they just do whatever they wanted?
Well, the Witan shows us that the kings relied on the counsel of their advisors. And the Witan could even elect a new king if the previous one died without a clear heir.
Wow, so they had some real power.
They did.
That's pretty interesting. It's a more complex system than you might think. The sources also mentioned that women had more agency in Anglo-Saxon society than in later periods. Is that true?
Yes, compared to later medieval society, Anglo-Saxon women did have a surprising degree of autonomy. They could own property, run businesses, even exert some political influence.
Well, I imagine there were still limits, right?
Of course, their lives were still very much shaped by societal expectations.
Right, right. It's still interesting, though. It challenges our assumptions about gender roles back then,
Yeah.
It's a reminder to always question what we think we know and dig a little deeper.
I agree.
Okay, so jumping back to the Normans for a sec, we talked about feudalism, but, like, what did it actually look like in practice? What was daily life like under that system?
Well, for most people, life revolved around agriculture. Peasants worked the land, and in return, they owed labor and a portion of their crops to their lord.
Sounds like a tough life.
It was, and in exchange, the lord offered protection and some semblance of justice, although that wasn't always fair or consistent, of course.
Right. It doesn't seem like there was much room for, like, social mobility.
No, not really.
The sources also really emphasized the Norman French influence on the English language. Are there any specific examples that kind of, like, bring that to life?
Well, the evolution of food words is a good illustration. Before the Normans, the words for cow and pig were just ca and pick.
Huh.
But after the conquest, we adopted the French-derived words beef and pork for the meat we eat.
Oh, wow. I never thought about that. It's like a reminder of how the Normans influenced not just the language, but the whole dining culture.
Exactly. Language is a window into these broader cultural shifts.
It's amazing how much you can learn just from looking at how words changed over time.
It is. And it wasn't just new words either. Norman French influenced English grammar and structure as well.
So they didn't just add ingredients, they changed the whole recipe.
Precisely.
Okay, so the medieval period,
Yeah.
it seems so long and, like, complex.
Mm.
Were there any defining features when it comes to government and politics?
Well, the Plantagenet dynasty, which ruled for a big chunk of this era, they were constantly at war,
Always fighting.
pretty much, both within England and abroad. King John, for example, he famously clashed with his barons, which led to the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215.
Oh, yeah, the Magna Carta. That's supposed to be, like, a super important document, but honestly, I don't really remember what it was all about.
Well, the Magna Carta was pretty revolutionary for its time. It limited the king's power and affirmed certain rights for the nobility.
So even back then, people were trying to put checks on executive power.
Yes, exactly. It was a challenge to the idea that the king was above the law.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It
And
is.
it wasn't just the nobility pushing for change either. We talked about the peasants' revolt earlier.
Yeah.
What caused that? Like, what are the root causes of that uprising?
Well, the Peasants' Revolt, it was sparked by a whole bunch of factors. You had high taxes to fund all those wars, and then a growing gap between the rich and poor.
Right.
And then there were these repressive policies that limited the peasants' freedoms.
And the Black Death probably didn't help either, right?
No, not at all. The Black Death actually played a big role. Because it created a labor shortage, it gave the peasants more power to demand better conditions.
It's interesting how history is rarely shaped by just one event. It's usually a bunch of things coming together at the same time.
Exactly. It's all interconnected.
Okay, but even with all this unrest, there were still those amazing advances. We talked about mechanical clocks, which are mind-blowing. What other technological innovations were happening during this time?
One that often gets overlooked is eyeglasses. Before the 13th century, if you had bad eyesight, you were in trouble. But eyeglasses, they were a game changer.
Yeah, seriously. It's easy to focus on the big inventions, but something as simple as eyeglasses had a huge impact on daily life.
Oh, absolutely.
Speaking of impact, the church was a huge force throughout this whole period. What was its role, and were there any challenges to its authority?
Well, the Catholic Church, it was a central institution in medieval life. It influenced everything: politics, law, art, architecture, education. I mean, just look at the magnificent cathedrals they built, like Canterbury and Salisbury. Those are testaments to the church's power.
They are pretty impressive.
Mhm.
But was everyone happy with the church's power? Was there anyone who, like, disagreed or wanted reform?
Oh, there were definitely movements for religious reform throughout this period. People criticized the church's wealth. They saw corruption and they questioned the authority of the clergy.
So even in an era that was so focused on religion, there were still people who questioned the status quo.
Exactly.
It seems like that desire for change, that willingness to challenge authority, it's a recurring theme throughout history.
It is. It speaks to something fundamental about human nature, our
Yeah.
desire for improvement, for a better world.
Okay, we've talked about government, religion, technology. What about art and culture? What were some defining trends during this time?
Well, the Anglo-Saxons were known for their intricate metalwork, epic poems like Beowulf, and these beautifully illuminated
I've
manuscripts.
seen pictures of those manuscripts. They're incredible. The level of detail is insane. It's like they poured their whole world into those pages.
They're really something else. And of course, we can't forget the Bayeux Tapestry, which is this 70-meter-long embroidered cloth that depicts the Norman conquest in incredible detail.
Like a giant graphic novel, but embroidered.
Exactly.
It's amazing how they captured such a significant event through art.
And speaking of storytelling, the medieval period also saw the rise of vernacular literature. Writers like Geoffrey Chaucer started using English to create these lasting works of art, like the Canterbury Tales.
Canterbury Tales are still so funny and surprisingly relatable even after all these years.
It shows you how human nature really hasn't changed that much.
That's actually kind of comforting.
It is.
Okay, so we've delved into the political stuff, religion, technology, even art. But what about everyday life? What was it like for, the average person living through all this?
Well, for most people, life was a struggle. The vast majority were peasants, tied to the land, working constantly to produce food.
So not a lot of time for leisure activities.
Not really. But that doesn't mean their lives were completely without joy or community. There were feasts, festivals, religious holidays. These were opportunities for people to come together, celebrate, and find solace.
Right. Even in difficult times, people find ways to connect and have fun. What did people actually eat back then? Was it all just bread and gruel?
Well, the diet varied depending on social class and where you lived. But for most people, bread, porridge, cheese, and ale were staples. Meat was more of a luxury, although hunting and fishing provided some additional protein.
Sounds like a pretty carb-heavy diet.
It was.
What about clothes? Did fashion even exist back then?
Well, clothing was mostly determined by your social status. Peasants wore simple tunics and cloaks made from wool or linen, while the nobility could afford finer fabrics and more elaborate designs.
So even back then, clothes were a way to show off your status.
There were.
Okay, last question about daily life. What was it like to be a child in medieval England?
Well, childhood was a very different experience back then compared to today. Children were expected to contribute to the household or start working from a young age.
So no video games or smartphones?
No. But of course, children still played. They had their own games and pastimes, often imitating what they saw adults doing.
I can picture it now. A bunch of kids running around pretending to be knights. It's a good reminder that even though childhood is a universal experience, how we see it is shaped by our culture and the time we live in.
That's a great point.
Okay, before we wrap up part 2 of this incredible deep dive, I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier, the printing press.
Ah, yes, the printing press.
It came a bit later than the period we're focusing on, but it totally revolutionized the world, right?
It did. It's hard to overstate its impact.
It's amazing how one invention could change so much. It democratized knowledge, fueled the Renaissance, and led to the scientific revolution.
It really shows you the power of technology.
And it's a reminder that even small innovations can have huge world-changing effects.
That's true.
That's actually a perfect segue to our final part. We'll wrap up this whole exploration of England's transformation from 410 to 1400 AD. But before we do that, I have one more question. We've been so focused on England, but what was going on in the rest of Europe during this time?
That's a great question. It reminds us that history is all interconnected.
So it wasn't just in England going through all these crazy changes.
No, not at all. The rest of Europe was experiencing its own share of dramatic events.
So tell me what else was happening. What was going on elsewhere?
Well, for instance, the Vikings weren't just raiding England. They were exploring and settling vast areas, from North America all the way to Eastern Europe.
Wow, they got around. I guess that explains why their influence is still felt in so many different places. What else was happening in Europe?
Well, while the Normans were conquering England, other parts of Europe were dealing with the rise of powerful empires like the Holy Roman Empire. New kingdoms were forming, new religions were spreading, and trade routes were evolving, connecting people and ideas across the continent.
So it was a dynamic and interconnected world, even back then. It's a good reminder that English history doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's all part of this bigger story of European history.
Exactly. And understanding that broader context helps us appreciate the unique path that England took.
This has been an amazing journey so far. We've learned so much about government, society, religion, technology, even everyday life in this period. Are you ready to wrap things up and give our listeners some final thoughts?
Absolutely. Let's move on to our final part and explore what it all means in the grand scheme of things.
All right, so we've gone through a lot, haven't we? From Roman Britain falling apart to almost the Renaissance. We saw kingdoms rise and fall, different cultures clashing, new ideas spreading. It's pretty amazing how people manage through all those challenges, you know?
It has been quite a journey, and it's true this was a time of massive change. But it wasn't like a straight line from point A to point B. Things were messy, complicated. There was progress, but also setbacks, innovation, but also conflict. It was all kind of tangled up together.
Yeah, it's like a good reminder that history isn't always neat and tidy, right?
Yeah.
That's what makes it so interesting to look back on.
I agree. And we see that in how England itself developed, right? From those separate Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to a more unified nation under the Normans.
Right. And through it all, we see those early versions of what we think of as English today. The language, the legal system, those cultural values that make England what it is.
Yes, exactly. And it's important to remember it's not just about what happened in England. It's also about how those events connect to what was happening all across Europe.
Right. Like the Vikings, they weren't just raiding England, and Christianity was spreading all over. And feudalism, that wasn't just an English thing.
Right. Everything was connected. English history is part of this bigger story, this European history.
It's like when you zoom out on a map, you see how all those different regions and events are linked together.
Exactly. And understanding that bigger picture really helps us appreciate how unique England's story is.
Absolutely. So what else should people listening remember about this period? What really stands out to you?
Well, I think it's important to remember that history isn't just about the big names, the kings and queens, the battles and treaties. It's also about everyday people, the peasants working the land, the craftspeople, the merchants. Their stories matter too.
It's those everyday stories that make history feel real, don't they? It's about understanding how people lived, worked, loved and struggled in those times.
Exactly. And when we connect with those stories, we start to see the common threads, the human experiences that we all share across time.
And we've seen some incredible resilience, haven't we? Like the Anglo-Saxons adapting to a new land, the Normans building their castles and changing the social order, even the peasants demanding their rights.
Yes, it's truly remarkable. It shows the human capacity for innovation, for adapting to change, for striving for a better world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is the most important thing we can learn from this period of English history?
That's a good question. I think the most important lesson is that change is constant. Societies evolve, technology changes, new ideas come along. Nothing stays the same forever.
It makes you think, doesn't it? All those people who came before us, they lived and loved and faced their own challenges, and they shaped the world we live in today.
We're all part of this ongoing story, this process of change and transformation.
That's a pretty powerful thought. So, to everyone listening, we've just scratched the surface here, and I hope this has made you curious to learn more. Go explore those sources, see what else you can discover about the past.
It's been a pleasure discussing this with you.
Likewise. And to everyone listening, thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep discovering those connections between the past and present. Until next time.